Hi, as I read my chapters today, I want you to think about some questions. For chapter 43, I want you to think about when Stanley hears Zero's stories. How does he feel about his own family? How do these stories make you feel? Here's chapter 43. We weren't always homeless, Zero said. I remember a yellow room. How old were you when you, Stanley started to ask, but couldn't find the right words. Moved out. I don't know. I must have been real little because I don't remember too much. I don't remember moving out. I remember standing in a crib with my mother singing to me. She held my wrist and made my hands clap together. She used to sing that song to me, that one you sing. It was different though. Zero spoke softly, as if searching his brain for memories and clues. And then later, I know we lived on the street, but I don't know why we left the house. I'm pretty sure it was a house and not an apartment. I know my room was yellow. It was late afternoon. They were resting in the shadow of the thumb. They had spent the morning picking onions and putting them in a sack. It didn't take long, but long enough so that they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave first hint of daylight, so they'd have plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley wanted to be sure he could find the right hole. Then they would hide it until everyone went to sleep. They would dig for as long as this seemed safe and not a second longer. And then, treasure or no treasure, they'd head up the dirt road. It was absolutely safe. They'd try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchen. I'm good at sneaking in and out of places, Zero had said. Remember, Stanley had warned, the door to the rec room squeaks. Now he lay on his back, trying to save his strength for the long days ahead. He wondered what happened to Zero's parents, but he didn't ask. Zero didn't like answering questions. It was better to just let him talk when he felt like it. Stanley thought about his own patterns. In his last letter, his mom was worried that he might have evicted from their apartment because of the smell of burning sneakers. They could easily become homeless as well. Again, he wondered if he'd been told that he can run away from camp. Were they told he was dead? An image appeared in his head and his parents hugging each other and crying. He tried not to think about it. Instead, he tried to recapture the feelings he'd had the night before, the inexplicable feeling of happiness, the sense of destiny. But those feelings didn't return. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They dunked their caps in the water hole before they put their hats on. Zero held the shovel, and Stanley carried the sack, which was crammed with onions and the 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of the broken jar in the mountain. This is where I found the shovel, Stanley said, pointing at a patch of weeds. Zero turned and looked up toward the top of the mountain. That's a long way. You were light, Stanley said. You'd already thrown up everything that was inside your stomach. He shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He stepped down on a loose rock, slipped, then fell hard. The next thing he knew, he was sliding down the deep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack, and onions spilled around him. He slid into a patch of weeds and grabbed onto a thorny vine. The vine ripped out of the earth, but slowed enough so that he was able to stop himself. Are you all right? Zero asked from above. Stanley groaned as he pulled a thorn out of the palm of his hand. Yeah, he said. He was all right. He was worried more than about the jars of water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Stanley pulled some thorns out of his pant legs. The jars hadn't broken. The onions had protected them, like styrofoam packing material. Glad you didn't do that when you were carrying me, Zero said. They lost about a third of the onions, but recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. When they reached the bottom, the sun was just starting to rise above the lake. They walked directly toward it. Soon they stood on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see the remains of the Mary Lou off in the distance. You thirsty? Stanley asked. No, said Zero. How about you? No, Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to take a drink, although they didn't mention it and it had become kind of a challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into the frying pan. It was a different spot from where they had climbed up. The easiest themselves down one ledge to another and let themselves slide down the places, being especially careful with the sack. Stanley could no longer see the Mary Lou, but he headed in what he thought was the right direction. As the sun rose, so did the familiar haze of heat and dirt. You thirsty? Zero asked. No, said Stanley. Because you have all 3 full jars of water, said Zero. I thought maybe it was getting too heavy for you. If you drink some, it will lighten your load. I'm not thirsty, said Stanley. But if you want a drink, I'll give you some. I'm not thirsty, said Zero. I was just worried about you. Stanley smiled. I'm a camel, he said. They walked for what seemed like a very long time and still never came across that Mary Lou. Stanley was pretty sure they were heading in the right direction. He remembered that when they left the boat, they were headed toward the setting sun. Now they were headed toward the rising sun. He knew the sun didn't rise and set exactly in the east and west, more southwest and southeast, but he wasn't sure how that made a difference. His throat felt as if he was coated with sandpaper. "You sure you're not thirsty?" he asked. "Not me," said Zero. His voice was dry and raspy. When they did finally take a drink, they agreed to do it at the same time. Zero, who was now carrying the sack, set it down and took out the 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to save the canteen for last, since it could be accidentally break. "You know I'm not thirsty," Stanley said, as he unscrewed the lid. "I'm just drinking so you will." "I'm not drinking. I'm just drinking so you will," said Zero. They clinked the jars together and, watching the other one, poured the water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first to spot the Mary Lou, maybe a quarter-mile away and just a little off to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even noon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. "I don't know what happened to my mother," Zero said. "She left and never came back." Stanley peeled an onion. "She couldn't always take me with her," Zero said. "Sometimes she had to do things by herself." Stanley had the feeling that Zero was explaining things to himself. "She'd tell me to wait in a certain place for her. When I was real little, I had to wait in small areas, like on a porch or step or doorway. 'Now don't leave here until I get back,' she'd say. I never liked it when she left. I had stuffed animal, a little giraffe I'd hung around with me the entire time. When I got bigger, I was allowed to stay in a bigger areas, like stay on this block or don't leave the park. But even then, I still held Jeffy." Stanley guessed that Jeffy was the name of the Zero's giraffe. "And then one day, she didn't come back," Zero said. His voice sounded suddenly hollow. "I waited for her at Laney Park." "Laney Park," said Stanley. "I've been there." "You know the playscape?" asked Zero. "Yeah, I played on it. I waited there for more than a month," said Zero. "You know that tunnel you travel through? Between the slide and the swing bridge? That's where I slept." They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about half of the water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. "When I left camp, I was heading straight toward the Big Thumb," he said. "I saw the boat off to the right, so that means we have to turn a little to the left." Zero was lost in thought. "What? Okay," he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. "Some kids had a birthday party," Zero said. "I guess it was about 2 weeks after my mother left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape and balloons were tied to it. The kids looked like the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I know I didn't belong at the party, even though it wasn't their playscape. There was the one mother who kept staring at me like I was some kind of monster. Then later a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake, but then the same mother told me, 'Go away.' And she told all the kids to stay away from me, so I never got that piece of cake. I ran away so fast I forgot Jeffy." "Did you ever find him? It?" For a moment Zero didn't answer. Then he said, "He wasn't real." Stanley thought again about his parents, how awful it would have been to never see or know if they were dead or alive. He realized that how Zero must have felt, not knowing what happened to his mother. He wondered why Zero never mentioned his father. "Hold on," Zero said, stopping abruptly. "We're going the wrong way." "No, this is right," said Stanley. "You were heading toward Big Thumb when you saw the boat off to the right," said Zero. "That means we should have turned right when we left the boat." "You sure?" Zero drew a diagram in the dirt. Stanley still wasn't sure. "We need to go this way," Zero said, first drawing a line on the map and then heading that way to himself. Stanley followed. It didn't feel right to him, but Zero seemed sure. Sometimes in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blocked the sun. It was a welcome relief. Once again, Stanley felt that destiny was on their side. Zero stopped and held out his arm to stop Stanley, too. "Listen," Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly, and Stanley began to make out the faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were still too far away to see the camp, but he could hear the blend in the distant voices. As they got closer, he occasionally could hear Mr. Sir's distinctive bark. They walked slowly and quietly, aware of the sounds that travel in both directions. They appeared a cluster of holes. "Let's wait here until they go in," said Zero. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure there was nothing living in it, then climbed down into the hole. Zero climbed into the one next to him. Despite having gone the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken nearly as long as Stanley had expected. Now they just had to wait. The sun cut through the cloud, and Stanley felt as if his heat beating down on him, but soon more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley and the hole. He waited until he was certain that the last campers had finished for the day. Then he waited a little longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed up on their holes and crept into camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, cradled his arms, instead of over his shoulder, to keep the jars from clanking against each other. A wave of terror rushed over him when he saw the compound, the tents, the rec room, the warden's cabin under the 2 oak trees. The fear made him dizzy. He took a breath, summoned his courage, and continued. That's the one, he whispered, pointing out the hole where he had found the gold tube. It was still about 50 yards away, but Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down into adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. So after reading chapter 43, how does Stanley feel after he hears the stories about Zero's family? How do these stories make you feel about Zero and the things that he went through? Please jot down answers on a piece of notebook paper.